no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about.
A voice that most people, most sane, rational people, smart people, agree is one of the most conservative voices in the state of Wisconsin and beyond.
Will is an indispensable organization.
The essential mission is to keep the republic.
Welcome back to If You Can Keep It, a podcast created by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. This is Pat Garrett, back with you, Communications Director here at WILL, back for episode 5 of what we like to call season 2. Joining me is Will President, once again, Rick Esenberg as our co-host, and we're ready for another big episode. In our last episode, we discussed free speech and what that means under the Trump administration. Give that episode a listen if you haven't. But today we're going to talk about another important issue, immigration. First, there was the border crisis, then the 2024 election, and now, so to speak, there's a new sheriff in town when it comes to immigration policy and how it's handled. So it's 2026. Immigration is on the top of mind for a lot of folks in the media, for voters, for people. And our guest today is Sam Hall, managing partner of Crivello, Nichols, and Hall. Sam holds an AV preeminent rating for being among the best lawyers in America, and he's part of one of the biggest immigration-related cases happening in Wisconsin right now. So thanks for being with us today, Sam, and thanks for being such a good friend of Will.
Thanks for having me on.
Rick, welcome back, and we're going to start back with you. Immigration is a big issue. We've seen it in conservative circles, but it all comes back to this conversation over what it means to be an American. We are a nation of immigrants. But in 2026, in the MAGA narrative out there is this idea of a heritage American versus a newly arrived naturalized citizen. So, Rick, we're asking you. We're going to start with you. What makes an American citizen in your eyes?
Well, I mean, there's a legal answer to that. An American citizen is one who has followed the applicable requirements under the law to be a citizen. Now, that can be very simple. You can be born here, or at least born here to persons who are in the country lawfully, depending upon how you feel about birthright citizenship. Or you can immigrate here legally and follow the requisite procedures to become a citizen. Now, this business about heritage Americans really isn't concerned with the legalities of the matter. It's this notion that somehow you have to have been here for a particular period of time, or your ancestors have to have been here for a particular period of time, and perhaps you even have to be of, certain ethnicities that have had longstanding presence in the United States. I think that's hot garbage. I think I am more in the camp of America is a nation that's defined not so much by ethnicity as it is by creed. But I don't think it's true that America's immigration policy should be built solely on whether someone is willing to formally adhere to the dictates of the American creed, however you define that. I think that there are also I think concerns about assimilation is because that creed is embedded in a certain culture, very broadly defined. And so I do think that it's legitimate for people to be concerned when the percentage of foreign-born people in the country and those who are recently arrived here exceeds a certain percentage. And historians will tell you that over time, that when the percentage of foreign-born citizens reaches about 15%, and that's where we are now, that there is generally a backlash against immigration and a great deal of political pressure to put it on hold, so that there can be time and opportunity for assimilation and for the reduction of the kind of cultural counterclashes that high levels of immigration can sometimes create.
Sam, what do you think? Like to me, I think, America isn't a story of immigration, right? From the very beginning. And I do think, and we'll get into this, there's definitely, I think, ways that that's been abused and maybe done improperly, and we'll talk about those. But Sam, same question to you. What makes an American citizen?
I mean, anytime we talk about citizenship, it's really fundamentally the bond that brings us together. It's the point of connection that is shared across gender, across race, across ethnicity. It really is that bond. Whenever I think of immigration, I can't help but think back to President Reagan's speech on the shining city on the hill. And I feel like as we're entering this debate and potentially redefining what it is to be a citizen, or this discussion almost opens up to, Jesus, our second class of citizenship between the heritage versus naturalized citizens. It all really flies in the face of I think what President Reagan was talking about there. I think we lose some of that. We lose some of what it is to be American. We lose some of that shining city on the hill when we find those divisions. So, I think it's fundamentally about defining that bond that brings us together. And I don't have anything more to add than what Rick did, because legally, obviously, that's right on. He had it right on the head.
Charlie Cook, Pat, has a pretty good argument in the recent issue of National Review, which focuses on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And he says he believes America is a creedal nation. He, of course, is an immigrant, was born in England. And he says that, one of the things that we can insist upon is that those who would immigrate here, if we're a creedal nation, that those who immigrate here believe in the creed, and that becomes the bond that holds us together, and that we used to say that America was a melting pot, and I think in many respects that's true. We have a culture which it's predominantly a Western culture. It's predominantly a Judeo-Christian culture, but it also has been changed by people who have immigrated here, and that the metaphor of the melting pot, of something where you put many strands of culture together and you actually form something which is certainly related to the past, but it's a little bit different. There are a lot of people who would argue, I think, for a different metaphor. They want a mosaic, right? This multicultural mosaic where we each remain in some sense separate from each other and defined by ancestors who most of us could not even name. I mean, there are very few people here who actually really even know who their great grandparents were, and certainly not beyond that. And I think that second metaphor is inferior, and it's not the one that should drive the way that we think about immigration. I think that the traditional melting pot metaphor was the one that got it right.
I do want to get into this because, Sam, you brought up Reagan. Not a lot of people listening to this podcast will have known him or voted for him or maybe even heard him speak. I didn't get to vote for him. I'm not sure if you did. I know Rick, just based slightly on what I know about Rick's age that we won't dive into, probably voted for Ronald Reagan once or twice, but
probably.
Probably. But for those of us, obviously, who haven't voted for him, who can conservatives look to for this immigration viewpoint? Because right now, I think it's kind of dominated by Stephen Miller on the Trump administration, the President Trump himself. Those are kind of the spokespeople on the right for immigration. Where is the Reagan voice? And it may not be Republican. It might not be Democrat either. There may not be anyone.
From my perspective, I think the adult in the room on this issue has been the border czar, Tom Homan. And, I think throughout our podcast today, I'll probably bring him up more than once. But, I think, by all accounts, he's someone who's viewed as being tough on immigration and certainly seems to have support within the administration. but I think he gets it. I mean, I think he understands all of the moving parts and all of the different constituencies on this issue. And so, he's somebody who I think is someone to look to. And I think we're seeing the administration start to pivot to roll him out in a more prominent way, which is a good thing. I think that is going to help us on this cause.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we've seen after the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Pretti, we've seen a pivot in messaging from the Trump administration as to how the Minneapolis situation is going to be handled. We're obviously we're behind it at this point, and now this is all winding down. But was that the correct approach in some ways? Like, was that what should have happened, or should we have, what went wrong in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think primarily this has been an issue with messaging. I think we lost, and by we, I mean on the right, we lost the opportunity to be out messaging much in the way we are now, maybe 2 months ago. And again, I attribute a lot of that. What I do is represent law enforcement, and I attend a lot of these law enforcement conferences throughout the country. And ICE has been, ICE enforcement and immigration enforcement has been a major topic of discussion at those conferences. And Tom Homan has come to almost all of them. I mean, he's one of the busiest guys in Washington, and he's flying around the country meeting with local law enforcement since the election and talking about what the federal government is looking for in terms of partners with law enforcement. And his messaging, from my perspective, he calls it the way he sees it, and has very expressly said, look, if you don't want an operation occurring in your community, we need to have partners. We need to have local partners, just like any other federal law enforcement agency. ICE has limits as to how many officers they can send out into any particular area, and as they prioritize, they're looking around the country to see where do we have partners. And if we know that we have local law enforcement embedded in communities who's going to cooperate with us, who's going to share information with us, it's almost impossible that ICE would decide to prioritize that as an area for operation. So, we've seen significant operations in Chicago. We've seen significant operations in Minneapolis. What do those locations all have in common? Those are areas that, in Illinois, by virtue of state law, so well, you can't cooperate with the federal government on immigration. And in Minnesota, it was a conscious decision by the governor, the attorney general, the mayor, the Hennepin County sheriff, where they made a conscious decision to say, well, geez, we're not going to cooperate. We're not going to sign these 287 agreements. And for the entire year leading up to it, Tom Homan told everybody, if you don't do these agreements, if we don't know that we have a partner with you, we may have to conduct operations in your community. Whereas if we know we have a willing partner, it's unlikely we're going to show up. We're going to just wait for you to contact us. And this type of messaging, law enforcement heard loud and clear. I think they missed the memo in Minnesota and Illinois. But that type of messaging, I think we lost. I think by not allowing those messages to kind of reach the American public at the very infant stages of this really, set us back, and to some extent kind of allowed what happened in Minnesota to transpire.
I would agree with that. I mean, if we look at, polling, especially on just Trump approval is one thing, but what we saw in all of 2025 was, Trump's approval number on immigration, on deportations was 15, 20 points, even 20 points better, depending on the poll, better than where he is now. I mean, it's now his approval numbers are the same on all those issues. And we've really kind of seen that, change, and that it's like a switch went off. And I think what happened in Minnesota was the switch. And maybe it's because I think people saw the other side of what deportations look like. People getting, dragged out of cars. I don't know if I'm characterizing it right, but that's where I think public opinion has shifted once this was on everybody's TV screens every day.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sam. Now, states can't be commandeered into enforcing federal law. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't agree to do it. Uh, I think Minnesota went one step further, though. It not only refused to agree to cooperate with federal law enforcement, but the politicians there quite irresponsibly encouraged uh, protesters to physically impede federal law enforcement. And, I am not an expert on law enforcement like Sam is. However, I do know this, that it's a really bad idea to go out and wrestle with people that have guns. And I think that the irresponsibility of the people in Minnesota in particular goes well beyond the refusal to sign these agreements. That was part of it, but it was even worse than that. However, having said that, I think that and having acknowledged that what the Biden administration did in allowing unprecedented surges of uh, people into the country unlawfully was uh, historically irresponsible. Uh, it ought to have been clear to the administration that there are a whole set of problems with mass deportations, that it would be extremely difficult to even locate uh, 15 million people or whatever number it is who are in the country unlawfully without due process violations. Uh, that it would necessarily involve the deportation of people who would be sympathetic in the public eye, who would, they were not child rapists, they were not people who were felons, they were not, eating the dogs and eating the cats. They were just people who had come from, you know, countries that, one might call S-hole countries, where they didn't have opportunity and they wanted to come here to get opportunity. And some of them have been here for a long time and they've been law-abiding and they've been tax-paying and they've been here illegally. And that doesn't mean they get to stay, but it means that, you know, uh, masked agents with scary looking guns pulling them out of their houses isn't going to look very good on television and isn't going to be sympathetic. And probably was a step too far, I think. And I think maybe Homan understands that too now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that wasn't communicated effectively early on is the priorities of immigration enforcement. I mean, I think there's been this discussion of the mass deportation, and I think observers watching the news, seeing what was occurring in Minnesota, may have felt, well, this is what mass deportation looks like. But in reality, these really were targeted individuals where, warrants were issued for specific individuals that the government is seeking to remove. The focus has remained on identifying and removing violent offenders, right? And so that continues to be the priority. And this is where the partnerships with local law enforcement are so important, because I think the federal government assumes that, bad people are going to do bad things from time to time. And when they do and they end up in a jail, we're gonna remove them at that point. So rather than going door to door or looking in the streets, we're going to wait for an individual to do something to get themselves arrested. And then instead of, trying to take somebody into custody, into ICE custody, out in the middle of the street where there's, mobs of protesters and things like that, we could do it in the confines of a jail, where we literally just within a computer screen switch somebody's custody from state or local custody to federal custody, and then, start that removal process. And, again, from a messaging standpoint, that got lost in all of this. I think and part of it has been, the inability to really talk about individual specific cases. And, I mean, a little bit later, I'll talk about one specific incident that's occurred here in Wisconsin that I think is really telling as to how this process works. But the bottom line is allowing this to spill into the streets was the problem. The fact that, we needed to have immigration enforcement occurring in the streets rather than occurring within, a courthouse, within a jail setting. And fundamentally, that occurred because of failed leadership in Minnesota. That lack of leadership, the ability and willingness to work with federal law enforcement partners really left the federal government no choice. And that hurt the pro-immigration enforcement. That hurt us with messaging on that front.
Rick, what would be your advice to the Trump administration on immigration enforcement? And maybe it's some of what Sam has said, but what would you say is needs to change?
They need to stay focused on that class of immigrants who have had involvement with the criminal justice system, right? Who have, been arrested for something other than entering the country unlawfully, and that will leave many, many people in the country unlawfully. And so what do you do about that? I think that they should. I just think the most effective way to manage that population is through some type of e-verify system, which prohibits employers from hiring these folks with impunity, right? And then you will, Mitt Romney, they made fun of Mitt Romney for saying this in 2012, but you will have a reduction in the population of people who are here unlawfully if that happens. Now, the problem, of course, is, and this is the thing that people don't want to talk about, is to some extent our economy has become dependent on a labor supply that includes people who are here illegally, and that if those people were to disappear overnight, you'd have some economic dislocation. I remember a talk by Peggy Noonan, it must have been 11, 12 years ago, that she gave to at a Bradley sponsored event. And she said, look, comprehensive immigration reform is really important. We need to do that, but we can't do it until the borders are under control, because nobody will trust the type of grand bargain that was made during the Reagan administration anymore, because that one broke down because we didn't have enforcement of the law. So you got to get the borders under control first. Well, the borders are under control right now. That is the one thing that the Trump administration has done very well in this area. And so it may be that we have a unique opportunity to deal with this problem, perhaps through some type of, not pathway to citizenship. I don't think people are owed a pathway to citizenship, but perhaps through the creation of a temporary worker status, which will, sort of manage the pairing and reduction of this population.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think what we see from, I think what we've seen on immigration in the past is the word amnesty is toxic now, especially on the Republican side. When Lindsey Graham back in the day came up with an amnesty plan, in a way it was called Grahamnesty, right? And he was branded with it, and it, maybe almost cost him an election. And so Peggy's point is that the border needs to be secure, and that's when the conversation can start. We are at that point. But I think I also think on the right, you just don't see the appetite for this, partially because, Rick, I think you alluded to this earlier. We saw self-deportations was kind of what Romney was getting at. Self-deportations are on the rise. I think if you're talking to Stephen Miller, maybe even private or public, I'm just speculating, I've never talked to the man, but he would say something along the lines of, this whole show in Minnesota sent a message that we are cracking down on immigration. That will reduce border crossings, that will cause more self-deportations to go up. What do you guys think that theory is possible? It's not even if you agree with it, but is it possible?
I think it's possible, but I also think it will come to a point where that will stop. I mean, I do think there's going to be a temporary blip, and I think we're in the midst of it now, where there are more self-deportations. We're seeing it even within jails. You know, if ICE has designated somebody that they're intending to remove, we're seeing more and more cases of individuals just simply self-deporting, where, okay, we don't need to go through this process, we'll waive all the hearings. And we're seeing that because the outcomes have become relatively certain as you run through the removal process. But back to Rick's point too, I also, you know, I think it's right that the border needs to be secured first, and I wholeheartedly agree that that has been a great success of the Trump administration, both the first term and now the second term, where we are in a very different and much better place with regard to securing the border. But, you know, from a practical and political perspective, I'm a big supporter of just continuing to work on things that you can build broad coalitions on. And before getting to, you know, the E-Verify systems and kind of what do we do with the, you know, population that, you know, may be here illegally but isn't causing trouble, we do have a large and significant group of individuals who are illegally in the country and are causing trouble. And so, you know, just as we focus on, well, geez, we've got to secure the border first before we talk about what to do next, I would argue, well, we need to secure the border, which we've largely done. And now we need to focus on removing the, you know, folks that are here illegally and who are violent and committing offenses, because there's, you know, to me, a broad consensus that supports doing that. When you see some of these, you know, as the president would describe them as the bad hombres, when you see what some of these individuals have done or have been accused of doing, very few people are going to support keeping them in the country. And so I think building up some momentum, securing the border, being very clear to who we're targeting for removal, and trying to be just as effective with that as they were with securing the border. And then, you know, we can cross the bridge another day with what to do with law-abiding individuals, you know, who are here, and otherwise law-abiding individuals who are here in the country illegally.
I don't disagree that that shouldn't remain a priority. I'm not sure that it has been the priority. I mean, maybe these statistics are wrong, but I've seen statistics which show a supermajority of the people who have been detained do not fall into that category. They had no prior involvement with the criminal justice system other than entering the country unlawfully. And I don't know that these efforts have been targeted towards that population. Again, maybe the statistics are wrong, but those are the statistics that I've seen.
And I operate in somewhat of a vacuum in terms of my expertise in working with law enforcement. 100% of the cases that I'm seeing are individuals who, you know, have committed violent offenses. And I guess, you know, so you may be right as well, but at the end of the day, the administration ought to be focusing on talking about those individuals that are in the category of, you know, these are violent offenders that need to be removed. And you know, as an example, I'm going to go ahead and mention this now. In Wisconsin, just at the end of January, because I think this is a good example of how this process typically plays out. There was an individual who was pulled over in Columbia County, Wisconsin, who was speeding, had his brights on, and refused to turn them off despite oncoming traffic. Happens all the time. Officers effectuate a traffic stop. Individual doesn't have a driver's license and doesn't speak English. And so officers work to try to get a name and a date of birth so that they can run them in the computer system, end up involving a translator. They spend an hour at the scene on the side of the highway. The individual ends up giving a fake name and a fake birth date. And so they make the decision to arrest them and book them into the jail. Law enforcement at this stage, when they're having this stop, they have no immigration information. Like when they type the name and date of birth or driver's license into the computer, no immigration information comes up on that at all. What does happen though is when the individual's booked into jail and their fingerprints are taken, that triggers the alert. Okay, well, now we know who we have. We have his real name, we have his date of birth, we know that he's from Nicaragua, and he does not have legal status. ICE has issued a detainer warrant for him. In addition, we know that this individual has a 2022 felony warrant related to domestic violence, strangulation, suffocation, assault, battery that came out of Dane County that the individual absconded from. So he has this open warrant because he fled town. That's why he's given the fake name. So this individual gets brought in front of a judge for a bail and bond hearing, and he gets a $500 bail. So despite obstructing an officer, despite these outstanding felony warrants, the judge gives a $500 bail. It's at that moment that ICE says, no, that's not going to fly. We want this individual, and we're going to come to pick him up. Because this individual makes his $500 cash bail, what do we think the odds are of him showing up for his next court hearing? It's just not going to happen. And so that's how this process works. And I feel like when that story comes out, and there's thousands of them, right? There's thousands of these incidents that are occurring. I think any common sense American is going to look at this and say, well, yes, that's exactly what should. First of all, what is the judge thinking giving a $500 bail in that situation? But if that does happen, the backstop we have is that the federal government can remove the individual. I think the more that those stories are discussed and the more that the administration puts that information out there, again, I think even any common sense American is going to look at that and say, yeah, well, this is exactly what should be happening.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And I think one of the ways you get that story out there is you prioritize your efforts on those cases, right? And you don't, the sort of random pickup kind of stuff is just, not something that I think is going to work out very well. And maybe that will happen now. I think that what we need to have, and Sam, it sounds like you would agree with me, we have to need more Homan and less Noam and more Miller.
100%. And I think the administration has got that figured out now. I think we're in a much better spot.
This was a great discussion. I want to kind of pivot to this idea, though, that so if you talk, kind of the how we got here, we talked a little bit about the border. There's a court case here in Wisconsin. I know Sam's very, informed on it. There's also this policy of sanctuary cities and this idea that, you can kind of protest the government's immigration stance by not not participating. I think that's dangerous. I think it's being done in some ways in the name of federalism. I've seen that. And so, Rick, I'd love your take on that. But, if we're telling, if we were to speak to a more liberal audience, let's say, about this push for sanctuary cities or this push to stop law enforcement from working with ICE, like local sheriffs, for example, why is that problematic in itself?
We live in a time where everybody gets pushed to the extremes. As a matter of tribal loyalty. Now, our friends on the left have decided that the distinction between legal and illegal immigration is largely irrelevant or at best of secondary or tertiary importance. And so, when you see the rhetoric around this, they talk about immigration without specifying between the two. That's really an odd position to take. There are almost no countries in the world that don't have some type of immigration restrictions. I think that it would be great to have a house in Switzerland. Wonderful, beautiful country. No matter how much money I have to spend on one, I don't think I'd find it very easy to immigrate to Switzerland. They don't. And part of that, I think, is sort of endemic in the notion of democracy, and particularly a social democracy that has a lot of of welfare benefits. I mean, you can't allow. I mean, Milton Friedman said this years ago that you can either have a welfare state or you can have open borders, but you can't have both, right? Because if you have a generous welfare state and you let everybody in the world come, then you're quickly going to find yourself bankrupt. You also may find yourself in a situation where Sam talked earlier about the bonds that hold us together. These bonds are necessary to have a democracy. I mean, you can't have a liberal democracy, and by liberal I mean classically liberal and not Democratic Party platform liberal. You can't have that unless people are committed to the operation of the system and willing to lose, right? If every election is existential, such that everything in your power has to be done to obtain victory, democracy won't last very long. And one of the reasons that we've been able to have that in the United States is that the realm of possible outcomes is limited. But when you start to bring folks in who don't uh, whose preferences differ dramatically from those who are already here, the Overton window, the realm of what's possible becomes way too large, and people are no longer willing to lose. When we haven't had that problem with immigration in the United States because, we've largely had immigration from Latin America, and that just doesn't lead to the kind of culture clashes that we've seen, in Europe, where you have, I think, an attempt to integrate two more radically different, cultures. I always use the example of the Netherlands, which was, a very use whatever word you want, tolerant, socially liberal, open type of place. And then you had massive influx of people who do not see the world that way. That isn't their culture. That isn't the way they think things ought to be. And you start to have, a breakdown of institutional norms around having a democratic republic. And so I think this idea that there's no distinction between lawful and unlawful immigration is a dangerous one, and one that ultimately leads not to inclusion but division. Yet, that's what I think that's what we're seeing too much of that on the American left today because, they've decided that the compassionate thing is to not draw that distinction. And I think that's wrong. I think that's allowing notions of equity and non-discrimination to exceed their bounds.
Sam, what about from a practical standpoint? I thought Rick just gave a great, like, kind of philosophical take. What about how our lives are affected on a day-to-day?
That's what Rick is given to, Pat.
There's nobody better than Rick to do that. But, I think from a practical standpoint, when I think of kind of the left's response to this, I keep coming back to be careful what you ask for. When you brought up this litigation in Wisconsin, and there's similar litigation elsewhere around the country where the left is attempting to, obtain court orders saying that, well, geez, the local sheriff cannot partner with ICE, cannot cooperate with ICE, cannot honor the detainer warrants that are issued by Homeland Security. And, I keep coming back to be careful what you ask for, because if in the end, that becomes the law of the land. If it says that, if the courts end up holding that, there's no role for local law enforcement to have any level of cooperation with ICE, but, I'm here to tell you, Homeland Security is still going to remove people. They are still going to seek out illegal aliens and attempt to remove them from the country. And when that occurs, it's going to occur in the streets. And it's going to occur in the communities. And it's going to occur in workplaces. And I think that's the last thing anybody wants. If Homeland Security can move forward with the removal of someone here illegally, by virtue of having the individual administratively changed from one custody to another custody while they're in the confines of a jail cell, that's better for everyone. It's better for the safety in our communities. It's better for the individual who's the subject of the removal. It's certainly safer for our officers. And so, again, we see an example of what transpired in Minnesota. And if we want to avoid that, if the left wants to avoid that, the answer is these partnerships. The answer is to allow local law enforcement to do their job and to coordinate with federal law enforcement like they do on child sex cases, human trafficking. Local law enforcement partners with federal law enforcement every single day. And if we allow that to simply play out, you're incredibly unlikely to see operations like what we've seen in Minnesota. And I think the left understands that. I mean, the cynical part of me thinks that they know full well what's going on here, and they see it as a wedge issue that they can potentially fundraise off of and things like that. But it's doing a real disservice to the entire community, and I think that's unfortunate.
If the left were to get their way, could that, in theory, then could they stop going after human trafficking and all these other cases too? Like if they break down this cooperation between federal and...
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, one of the things, as we, I guess I'll pivot here and talk a little bit about our litigation here in Wisconsin. And I'm not going to divulge any state secrets here. But the case was filed as an original action against several sheriffs in the state Supreme Court. And, the fundamental question asked by the ACLU in that original action is, can the sheriffs honor the ICE detainers, or does that violate state law? And they really couched it, or attempted to couch it, purely in state law theories. Ultimately, the state Supreme Court accepted the case for original jurisdiction, but then added 3 additional questions that, in our view, significantly impacted and implicated federal law, implicated preemption, implicated the 287 agreements themselves in terms of the federal empowerment of local law enforcement. And when we saw that, we made the decision to remove the case to federal court. And now I think that's almost never happened. I know there was at least one prior occasion a few decades ago, but the concept of taking a case from the state Supreme Court and removing it to a district court is just not something we see every day. But when we saw how the state Supreme Court had structured the issues for briefing and for an eventual decision, it implicated all sorts of federal issues. And so we ended up removing it to federal court based on federal question and based on federal officer removal, because we maintained that when the sheriffs operate under these 287 agreements, they're actually operating as federal law enforcement. They've effectively been deputized as federal immigration officers when they're operating in this limited space.
And that's not a new thing under Trump, though, right? Like no, this has happened under previous presidents.
These 287G agreements have existed since 1996. The federal law was changed in 1996 to allow for this. The thing I will say that has changed is that early in that process, I think many sheriffs and others in law enforcement didn't feel a need to have the 287 agreements because they saw the ICE detainers, the detainer warrants, that, again, they're only signed by Homeland Security. They're not signed by a judge. But they have always viewed that historically as no different than a U.S. Marshal's warrant or, FBI or anybody else. And so even without a 287 agreement, if Homeland Security wanted the individual, they would hold them. No different than if a different state has an extraditable offense and a warrant, they'll hold and they'll wait for the governor's warrant to arrive. What has changed over the years is kind of a higher emphasis being placed on, okay, is that really legal? I think the sheriffs had always viewed there's a U.S. Supreme Court decision in Riverside County out of California that, had essentially stood for the proposition that an individual can be held without a probable cause hearing for, up to around 72 hours. And so sheriffs had felt, well, we can hold this, if we can hold the individual on the front end for up to 72 hours before they see a judge, we can hold them on the back end as well based on these warrants. That has never been tested. I'm not so sure I agree with that premise of law. But what's evolved is to say, okay, well, if we sign these 287 agreements, we have federal law enforcement authority, right? And while it's, maybe an open question whether a, state officer can effectuate a custodial arrest based on the detainer warrant, because it's only signed by Homeland Security, it's not signed by a judge, Congress has authorized it. Congress has very clearly authorized a custodial arrest based on the Homeland Security warrant. But Congress has also listed off the officers that can conduct those arrests, and they're federal officers, the federal immigration officers. So the pivot really has been to say, we feel we need these 287 agreements in place because that gives us the formal conferral of federal law enforcement authority, so that if transferring custody in the confines of a jail constitutes an arrest, we're not performing that arrest as a state officer. We're performing that arrest as effectively a federal immigration officer, which Congress has very clearly empowered a custodial arrest to take place. And so that's been the pivot. NBC just ran an article, I believe yesterday, talking that there's been a 950% increase in the number of local sheriffs signing these 287G agreements. And I'm here to tell you that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's going to continue. And it's because Homeland Security has cleaned up these agreements and provided a little bit more protection for the counties and for the sheriffs in terms of indemnification and the like. But again, it's a recognition of sheriffs to say, well, we feel it's important that we have this actual federal conferral of authority, and we get that through the operation of these agreements.
I want to touch on this other fact of this. Deportations have been happening for the last several presidents. This is not, I think I've even seen liberals on X being like, Barack Obama's deported more people than Donald Trump. I do think we've lost. I think the media has played a role in this, and I think obviously the tribes and the jerseys people put on has played a role in this. But there's this idea that what's happened now is totally unprecedented. We've never taken people out of the country like this, and I just think, while yes, what happened on the streets of Minneapolis is different, the practice itself is not.
No, I mean, again, this has existed before ICE, before ICE and before the existence of Homeland Security. This was all conducted through INS. And this is nothing new. And again, from a local law enforcement perspective, a local sheriff, a local police chief, their primary concern is protecting their community. And if there's somebody that is, committed a violent offense, that has done something that they're not supposed to, they want them out of the community. And if that means they're going off to prison, that's fine. And if that's not going to happen, or if you get a judge that's going to issue a $500 bail on an awful and violent felony warrant, if the backstop is that the federal government is able to remove the person from the country, amen. They are fundamentally, they care about protecting their community and getting people who do bad things off the streets and as quickly as possible. And that's not new. That existed during the Clinton administration. It existed during the Obama administration, the Bush administration, and it's ebbed and flowed. Every presidential administration comes in with points of emphasis and focus, and law enforcement is no different. Every new attorney general that comes in and the fleet of new U.S. attorneys that come in, will always say that this is going to be part of our focus of our enforcement activities. And, like it or not, President Trump made it very, very clear that this was going to be a primary focus of his administration, and it has been. It's kind of refreshing. We've got a politician that is, being very transparent in saying what he's intending to do, and it is exactly what has happened. But it doesn't mean that it hasn't occurred in these other administrations without the notoriety.
Yeah, I agreed completely. I think that's a really important point. Like people, have really put this on the president or his administration when there's been deportations beforehand, and we've had this process play out. Rick, do you have closing thoughts on immigration before I turn to our final segment of the episode?
We do have this problem in American politics where, uh, and this is particularly true as politics has become more polarized, more tribal, and more centralized, right? More centralized in the federal government, more centralized in the executive branch, that both Democratic and Republican administrations have sort of taken the approach that when they have power, they must exercise it to the max uh, before they lose it, as they almost certainly will. And this ironically hastens the point at which they're going to lose it. It's a mistake to think, we hear all the time that, people say, this is what I voted for. And we have politicians who say, yeah, we were elected to move the country in a particular direction. But that doesn't mean that moving it as hard and as fast as you possibly can isn't going to result in a significant amount of blowback and really uh, destroy whatever political room you had to make those moves. And so I think the problem here is that um, absolutely the Trump administration was elected to do something about unlawful immigration into the United States. And I think that, and then the disquiet with the economy and some cultural issues, I think, were the main things that drove uh, his election. But that doesn't mean that anything that you do towards those ends is going to be accepted. And I think that there was a need, and again, as we've discussed, perhaps the administration is beginning to recognize that, to use one's authority wisely and in ways that will not dissipate the support that puts you in the position to exercise that authority in the first place.
I think that's exactly right. I think the president, I mean, he won the election on the border, he won the election on immigration, and you could see. I think we'll see Democrats do well in certain states, in Minnesota being one of them. And the midterms will be, as they usually are, a recalibration of public opinion. I think we see this, when the Minnesota crisis hit, like a Trump's polling on immigration switched. I also think at the same time, all the stuff Sam talked about, if you still poll that issue, and I've seen recent surveys that have, when you poll the removing dangerous criminals, the number goes back up to in the 60s, 70%. I mean, it's not that complicated, really.
Yeah, the polling is weird on that because if you ask that question, absolutely, you will get super majorities. If you ask the question about deporting people who are in the country unlawfully, if you then ask the question about should we deport somebody who's been here 20 years and has had a job and paid taxes, then it breaks in the other way. And so, the problem is that all these policies need to be evaluated and enforced with nuance, and nuance is really unpopular today.
No, that's exactly right. It's why we're talking about Democrat presidents who've deported people as well, and and this is the world we live in.
You know who can speak with nuance, though, is Tom Homan. More Tom Homan is the answer, I think, because he gets it, and I think he just strikes the right balance. And there's a lot of time between now and November to right the ship. I think there does need to be some correction. We can do better on messaging. But hold on tight. It's going to be an interesting summer with the World Cup coming to the country. I think ICE is kind of standing down right now while the debate goes on in Washington on DHS funding. But at some point, I would expect it to ramp back up. And with the World Cup coming to town, it could be a very interesting summer.
When you say that about the World Cup, Sam, and ICE standing down, the thought occurred to me that sort of cue the left's invocation of the 1936 Berlin Olympics in about 10 seconds.
Yeah, you got it.
I'm not going to get into that, but as somebody who's a World War II buff, comparing what's happening in the United States now to what happened in Germany in the 1930s really makes me lose my religion.
Yeah.
Because they tell me that you don't know anything about the run up to World War II without telling me that you don't know anything about World War II.
Well, that's a perfect transition to our next segment that we're trying out for this episode. We used to do like a smart take segment, and I think I want to change this. Rick's such a history buff, and I think it's a good kind of closer to the episode. You know, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. So, Rick, if you could think of, and it doesn't have to relate to immigration or this episode, if you can think of a moment in history that we're due to repeat or mirror in some way, what is it?
I don't want to repeat what I already said, but I think that what we have now is a cycle of of overreach and failure that people get elected and they think that they have power now, and so they must use the 50.5% support that they have to impose their will on the rest of the population. And it never works, and it was never designed to work. We, Yuval Levin wrote this great book about the Constitution on the American Covenant, and he said, the problem, our constitutional system is not designed to create unity. It's not designed to create a world in which we all agree. The founders understood that that was absolutely impossible, it would never happen. But it is designed to manage disagreement. And one of the ways it does this is by making it very difficult in the United States for 51% of the people to vote to eat the other 49%. It requires super majorities. There's multiple decision-making points. It's designed to slow the government down. And I think we live in a time now where slowing down is very unpopular. Sam Pat will tell you that one of the phrases that triggers me is when somebody says, "You don't know what time it is," and therefore your concern for constitutional niceties and processes. It's just it's just a relic of your boomerdom. And I couldn't disagree with that more. I think that the experience of the last few administrations bears that out. And but it's a lesson that we don't seem willing to learn, so we are doomed to repeat it again and again.
Yeah, so I have the luxury of going second here to think about it. If I'm not working on immigration and ICE issues, the other issue that's affecting law enforcement quite a bit these days is the use of AI. And, as lawyers, AI is being deployed more and more, and we're starting to see it in law enforcement as well. And it's concerning to me. There's parts of it that I think are really fundamentally could change the world. But I feel like we are so focused on what's the next thing it can do? How do we keep pushing this forward? How do we, without really thinking through the guardrails that need to be put in place? We're not self-regulating ourselves. We're just, kind of racing to the finish. And so you talk about a specific incident in history. It takes me to the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, and it's this obscure fire, but it was a major event in New York. Where there's about 150 workers were killed at a fire, and they were killed because there was no workplace safety. OSHA didn't exist then. There were no regulations. So, you get this fire in this facility that's, making clothing. So all this flammable material, and, 150 people died because they couldn't, the doors were locked and there weren't enough exits because we were so focused at that time and in that revolution, and even looking back to the Industrial Revolution, and the safety was an afterthought. And what do we get now? We get OSHA with a $1 billion budget and all sorts of bureaucracy and regulation, I think we're doomed to repeat it. I see AI as being that where, we are so focused right now on where it will take us and not really considering self-regulating ourselves, that, if I look ahead 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, we're going to have a federal department of something that is going to be regulating AI, and it's going to turn into a huge bureaucratic mess that no one is going to be happy. And at the end, it's going to be our fault because as we're deploying this, we're not putting those guardrails in place. So I think we're doomed to repeat that.
I understand from reading over the weekend that AI is starting to get mad at us.
They're talking about AI. I saw it yesterday on X that they're testing AI with whether or not AI would rather misidentify Caitlyn Jenner or mispronoun Caitlyn Jenner versus deploying a nuclear weapon on the planet. And almost all of the AI models would rather deploy a nuclear weapon on the planet as compared to mispronouncing Caitlyn Jenner. The world's lost its mind. I don't know. Somewhere along the line, we have to be the ones to put in guardrails because otherwise, again, the government will do it for us, and it's not going to make any sense when that happens.
We have the same algorithm. I saw this exact tweet last night.
And AI believes that because it samples the language, and that's what it comes up with. We spend far more time worrying about mispronouncing than we do about firing nuclear weapons.
Sam, thanks for the incredible insight and for an awesome episode on immigration. I love the little teaser for AI that will be an episode at some point. There's no doubt about it. Thanks everyone for an incredible episode. And we are available wherever you get your podcast, and you can check us out at will-law.org/podcast. So thanks again for an awesome episode.
Yeah, Sam, thanks a lot for being willing to take the time to do this.
Thank you both. It was a fun time.